every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The small town's sense of peace is a fragile thing. It is a quiet understanding, a collective belief in the safety of tree-lined streets and the familiar faces of neighbors. It's the sound of bicycle chains clicking on a warm spring evening, the assurance that when the streetlights flicker on, children will come home for dinner. But on May 5, 1993, in West Memphis, Arkansas, that peace was not merely broken, it was systematically dismantled, dragged into the muddy water of a desolate creek, and left to die alongside 3 innocent children. The horror began not with a scream, but with the lengthening shadows of a Wednesday evening and the unanswered calls for dinner. 3 second graders, all 8 years old, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, had pedaled their bikes into a local patch of wilderness known as Robin Hood Hills, a place of childhood forts and secret trails, and vanished into the twilight. Their disappearance initially sparked the kind of low-level concern familiar to any parent. Maybe they had lost track of time. Maybe they were at a friend's house. But as night deepened, that concern curdled into a cold, gnawing dread. The parents called the police, but were initially told they had to wait 24 hours to file a missing persons report, a common but devastating policy of the time. Refusing to wait, the families began their own frantic search. By the next morning, a full-scale volunteer search was underway, a community united by a shared terror, combing the dense woods. It was shortly after 1:30 in the afternoon when a searcher, Juvenile Officer Steve Jones, spotted a small black shoe floating in the murky water of a drainage ditch that ran through the heart of Robin Hood Hills. The discovery that followed would carve a permanent scar onto the soul of the town. The boys were found submerged in the creek, a place the locals called the bayou. They were naked, their own shoelaces used to hog-tie them in grotesque contortions, right wrist to right ankle, left wrist to left ankle. Their bodies bore the marks of a savage, prolonged assault. In a community steeped in the fundamentalist traditions of the Bible Belt, the sheer brutality of the crime, and especially the cruel post-mortem mutilation of Christopher Byers, whispered of something ancient and evil. It spoke not of a simple, human monster, but of a demonic one. And in the America of the early 1990s, there was a popular and pervasive name for that kind of evil: Satanism. Welcome to Anatomy of Crime. In this episode, we will dissect one of the most infamous miscarriages of justice in modern American history. This is not just the story of a crime, but the story of a crime constructed from fear. Today, we explore the anatomy of mass hysteria, examining how a community's terror, a profoundly flawed investigation, and a moral panic sweeping the nation converged to condemn 3 teenagers, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr., for a crime they did not commit. We will dissect the flimsy evidence that was twisted into proof, the coerced confession that became a cornerstone of a lie, and the systemic failure that allowed a modern-day witch hunt to unfold, not in the distant past, but in a 20th century American court of law. West Memphis in 1993 was a town defined by what it was not. It was not its more famous neighbor, Memphis, Tennessee, which lay just across the Mississippi River, a glittering symbol of music and culture. West Memphis was a gritty blue-collar trucking hub, a place of low-income housing, trailer parks, and limited opportunities. It was a town where social currency was measured in conformity, where church on Sunday was a given, and where anyone who deviated from the norm was viewed with deep and abiding suspicion. The 3 victims were a part of this community's fabric. Stevie Branch was an adventurous and well-liked boy with a bright smile. Michael Moore was known as the thoughtful and responsible leader of their little trio. And Christopher Byers was a spirited, sometimes mischievous Cub Scout. Their deaths represented the ultimate violation of the town's perceived safety, an intrusion of pure evil into a world that believed itself protected by faith and familiarity. The investigation into their murders began under unimaginable pressure. A terrified public demanded answers, and the media descended on the small town. The West Memphis Police Department, however, was a small force completely unequipped to handle a crime of this complexity and brutality. Their procedural failures began at the very moment of discovery. The crime scene, the single most critical source of potential evidence, was almost immediately and irrevocably compromised. Dozens of police officers, search party volunteers, and even the boys' families trampled through the area, a chaotic churn of footprints and emotion that obliterated any chance of a clean forensic recovery. The county coroner arrived, conducted a cursory examination of the bodies while they were still in the water, and incorrectly declared that there were no signs of sexual assault. This initial error would have significant consequences later. Evidence was lost, mishandled, or simply overlooked. A bloody blanket found near the scene mysteriously vanished from police custody. When the bodies were finally removed, the police failed to properly drain the ditch, meaning any additional evidence, including a potential murder weapon, was likely washed away. It was a cascade of incompetence born from inexperience and panic. Lacking any physical evidence or credible leads, the police were adrift in a sea of rumor and speculation. And the strongest current pulling them was the Satanic Panic. This was a widespread moral panic that had been gaining momentum since the 1980s, a perfect storm of cultural anxiety, religious fervor, and media sensationalism. It was born from books like the now discredited memoir Michelle Remembers, which detailed supposed satanic ritual abuse, and fanned into a national inferno by daytime talk shows hosted by figures like Oprah and Geraldo Rivera, who ran lurid specials on the subject. A narrative took hold across America. A vast underground network of Satanists was operating in the shadows, engaging in ritual abuse, animal sacrifice, and human murder. Law enforcement agencies nationwide were attending seminars that taught them to look for signs of occult activity, black clothing, heavy metal music, pentagrams, and an interest in fantasy novels or games. It was a cultural witch hunt, and the West Memphis murders seemed to be the date, near the pagan holiday of Beltane, the location in the woods, the binding of the victims. It all fit the horrifying narrative that police had been trained to expect. The investigation quickly pivoted from a search for an unknown killer to a search for a known type of killer, a Satanist. The town's juvenile probation officer, Jerry Driver, had long held a personal conviction that a local teenager, Damian Eccles, was the leader of a burgeoning satanic cult. He immediately directed the police's attention to him. At 18, Damian Eccles was the living embodiment of everything West Memphis feared. He came from a desperately poor family that had moved constantly. He was a high school dropout who had spent time in a mental health facility for depression, a fact the prosecution would later twist into evidence of a disturbed mind. He was drawn to alternative spirituality as an escape, finding solace in Wicca, a nature-based religion worlds apart from Satanism, a distinction no one in authority cared to make. He read Stephen King and Aleister Crowley, listened to Metallica, and wore black, not as a sign of evil, but as the uniform of a disaffected teenager. He was intelligent, articulate, and he was the perfect outsider, a prepackaged villain for a story of good versus evil. Through Eccles, police focused on his best friend, 16-year-old Jason Baldwin. Baldwin was quieter, a shy boy with a talent for art who shared Eccles's taste in music and clothing. He was fiercely loyal to Damien, a friendship that would ultimately cost him his freedom. He was guilty only of association. The third teenager pulled into the net was 17-year-old Jesse Miskelly Jr. Miskelly was not a close friend of Eccles and Baldwin, more of a peripheral acquaintance. He was known for his short temper and his tendency to get into fights, but most significantly, he had a tested IQ of just 72, placing him in the borderline range of intellectual disability. He was highly suggestible, desperate for approval, and struggled to comprehend complex situations. These three teenagers, bound together by little more than their nonconformity and the police's singular focus, became the prime suspects in a triple homicide. They were the West Memphis Three. The police began to build their case not with evidence, but with gossip and character assassination. They interviewed dozens of local youths, offering rewards and threatening legal trouble to anyone who could provide a link, however tenuous, between the three suspects and the murders. They found Vicky Hutchison, a local woman who, in exchange for a $2,000 reward and the dropping of her own pending charges, claimed she had overheard a drunken confession from Jesse Miskelly at a wrestling event. Her story would later be proven to be a complete fabrication, but at the time, it was a crucial piece of the puzzle investigators were determined to solve. The true turning point, the moment that sealed the fate of the three teenagers, came on June 3, 1993, nearly a month after the murders. The police brought Jesse Miskelly in for what they called a voluntary interview. Jesse, naive and eager to please authority figures, went willingly. What followed was a 12-hour ordeal, an interrogation of which only two brief segments, totaling about 46 minutes, were audio recorded. For hours on end, without a lawyer or a parent present. A team of detectives, primarily led by Detective Bryn Ridge, relentlessly questioned the intellectually limited teenager. They used the classic Reed technique of interrogation, a psychologically manipulative method designed to break a subject's will and elicit a confession. They lied to him, telling him he had failed a polygraph test. They minimized the severity of the crime, suggesting he was just a witness and that if he cooperated, he could go home. They fed him specific, non-public details about the crime scene, details he could not have possibly known, and then pressured him to repeat them. The fragments of the recorded confession are a chilling document of coercion. Jesse's voice is slow, confused, and filled with uncertainty. He changes his story multiple times. He gets basic facts wrong, claiming the murders happened in the morning when the boys were verifiably in school. He describes sexual assault that medical examiners found no evidence of. The police can be heard on the tape, guiding him, correcting him, and praising him when he finally gives them the answers they want. At one point, when Jesse is confused about the timeline, an officer audibly coaches him. Think about the afternoon. When he can't remember details, they supply them. His confession describes a chaotic scene with three attackers, each using a different weapon, a version of events that was forensically inconsistent with the actual wounds on the victims. After 12 hours, he was exhausted, confused, and utterly broken. He gave them what they wanted: a rambling, contradictory story in which he, Damien Echols, and Jason Baldwin had murdered the three boys as part of a satanic ritual. It was a confession but it was a confession nonetheless. With Miss Kelly's statement in hand, the police had their linchpin. They promptly arrested all three teenagers. To a frightened and grieving community, the arrests were a profound relief. The monsters had been caught. The chief of police, Inspector Gary Gitchell, held a press conference radiating confidence. When a reporter asked him how sure he was that they had the right people on a scale of 1 to 10, Gitchell famously replied, "On a scale of 1 to 10, I'd say it's an 11. The town of West Memphis believed justice was at hand. The trials that would follow, however, would prove to be anything but just." The legal proceedings against the West Memphis Three were divided into two separate trials, a strategic move by the prosecution. First, they would try Jesse Miskelly alone. The logic was simple. If they could secure a conviction against him based on his own confession, it would create immense pressure and prejudice against Echols and Baldwin in their subsequent trial, even if the confession itself was inadmissible against them. Miskelly's trial began in January 1994. The prosecution's entire case rested on his taped statement. His defense attorney, Dan Stidham, argued forcefully that the confession was the product of police coercion. He called a psychologist to the stand who testified about Jesse's low IQ, his suggestibility, and his tendency to acquiesce to authority figures. Stidham pointed out the dozens of factual inconsistencies within the confession itself, demonstrating that Jesse knew nothing about the crime beyond what the police had told him. But the jury saw it differently. To them, the idea that someone would confess to such a heinous crime if they heard the words on the tape and they believed them. After a short deliberation, they found Jesse Miskelly Jr. guilty of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 40 years. With 1 conviction secured, the prosecution turned its full attention to Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin. Their joint trial began a month later, presided over by Judge David Burnett. Because Miskelly refused to recant his confession, but also refused to testify against his friends, his statement could not be used as evidence against them. This forced the prosecution to construct a case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, innuendo, and a carefully crafted narrative of satanic evil. The trial was a masterclass in prosecutorial overreach and character assassination. The lead prosecutor, John Fogelman, began his opening statement by telling the jury that the case was about the dark side of life, a satanic cult. From that moment on, the trial was not about finding the truth. It was about validating a pre-existing belief. The prosecutors presented Echols and Baldwin to the jury as demonic, baby-killing cultists. Their evidence was a curated collection of teenage angst and counterculture interests. Reframed as sinister proof of guilt, Damien Eccles's personal journals, filled with dark poetry and song lyrics, were read aloud in court. His interest in Wicca was deliberately conflated with Satanism. Jason Baldwin's love for the band Metallica and the fact that he owned a t-shirt from their And Justice for All tour was presented as evidence of a violent disposition. Even their choice of black clothing was used against them. To bolster this narrative, the prosecution called Dr. Dale Griffiths to the stand as a paid occult expert. Griffiths, who held a Ph.D. from an unaccredited university, testified that the murders bore all the hallmarks of a satanic human sacrifice. He claimed the mutilation of Christopher Byers was a sign of cannibalism, and that the hogtying of the victims was meant to humiliate them before their dark lord. His testimony was pure speculation, presented with the authority of academic expertise, and it had a powerful effect on the jury. The state's star witnesses were just as dubious. A jailhouse snitch named Michael Carson testified that Damien Echols had confessed to the murders while in a holding cell. Carson's story was wildly inconsistent, and he was later revealed to be an unreliable police informant with a long history of mental illness. Another key witness was Aaron Hutchison, the young son of Vicki Hutchison, the woman who had initially pointed the finger at Miss Kelly. Aaron testified that he had witnessed the three defendants at a coven meeting, or SBOT, in the woods. His testimony was confused and contradictory, and it was later revealed that he had been heavily coached by his mother and the police. Years later, he would fully recant, admitting the entire story was a lie. The defense, led by public defenders Val Price and Paul Ford for Echols and a court-appointed attorney for Baldwin, was vastly underfunded and overwhelmed. They were not just fighting the prosecution, they were fighting the entire community's hysteria. They presented alibi witnesses who placed the teenagers miles away from Robin Hood Hills on the night of the murders. They tried desperately to introduce evidence of an alternative suspect, a man who had shown up at a local Bojangles restaurant on the night of the murders, covered in mud and blood, acting strangely, and using the women's restroom. The manager had called the police, who took a blood sample, but then inexplicably lost it. This man, who became known as Mr. Bojangles, was questioned but quickly dismissed. Judge Burnett refused to allow the jury to hear this testimony, ruling it irrelevant. Perhaps the most bizarre and unsettling aspect of the trial was the behavior of John Mark Byers, the adoptive father of victim Christopher Byers. Throughout the proceedings, he was a volatile and theatrical presence, often shouting at Echols and Baldwin in the courtroom. He gave frequent emotional interviews to the press and the documentary crew from HBO that was filming the trial. In one infamous moment, he gave the filmmakers a hunting knife as a gift, which was later tested and found to have traces of blood on it. While the DNA technology of the time was limited, the blood was consistent with both his own and his stepson Christopher's blood types. The police, however, never considered him a serious suspect. After a month of testimony that focused more on musical tastes and fashion choices than on concrete facts, the case went to the jury. The deliberations were reportedly contentious. It was later revealed that the jury foreman, Kent Arnold, had violated the judge's instructions by telling other jurors about Jessie Miskelly's inadmissible confession, arguing that it proved the guilt of all three. On March 18, 1994, the verdicts were read. Jason Baldwin, 16 years old with no history of violence, was found guilty on 3 counts of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Damien Echols, the 18-year-old who had been cast as the demonic ringleader, was also found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection. As the verdicts were read, a cry of anguish rose from the defendants' families, while a sense of grim satisfaction settled over the rest of the courtroom. The town of West Memphis had its monsters, but for those who had watched the trial closely, it was chillingly clear that the real horror story was not over. It had just been enshrined into law. The convictions of the West Memphis Three marked the end of the trials, but they were the beginning of a long, arduous, and improbable battle for justice. In the cold reality of the Arkansas prison system, the 3 young men began to serve their sentences. Jason Baldwin and Jessie Miskelly faced the bleak prospect of dying of old age behind bars. Damien Echols faced a far more imminent fate on death row, where he spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, awaiting his execution date. For years, their situation seemed hopeless. The initial appeals, handled by their original overworked public defenders, were denied. The Arkansas courts, from the local level all the way to the state Supreme Court, repeatedly upheld the convictions, seemingly unwilling to confront the possibility that a catastrophic error had been made. The catalyst for change came from an unexpected source, a television documentary. In 1996, HBO premiered Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills. Filmmakers Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky had been granted unprecedented access to everyone involved in the case, and they used that access to create a devastatingly effective piece of investigative journalism. The film didn't just report on the case, it systematically deconstructed the prosecution's narrative. For the first time, a national audience saw the flimsy nature of the evidence, the absurd testimony of the occult expert, and the blatant prejudice that permeated the trial. They saw the coerced and contradictory confession of Jesse Miskelly in its proper context, and most importantly, they saw Damien, Jason, and Jesse not as the demonic caricatures painted by the prosecution, but as the young, scared, and often articulate teenagers they were. The film also cast a shadow of suspicion on others, most notably John Mark Byers, whose bizarre behavior and gift of a bloody knife to the filmmakers raised serious questions that the police had never bothered to ask. Paradise Lost was a bombshell. It sparked a grassroots movement, one of the first of its kind to be significantly amplified by the nascent power of the Internet. Websites and online forums sprang up, dedicated to dissecting the case evidence and advocating for the release of the three men. Benefit albums were produced, featuring artists like Tom Waits and Iggy Pop. The cause attracted the attention of high-profile celebrities who used their platforms to shine a national spotlight on the injustice. Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam became a tireless advocate, often speaking about the case at concerts. Henry Rollins of Black Flag championed their cause relentlessly. Johnny Depp, Winona Ryder, and the musician Patti Smith all became vocal supporters, contributing significant funds and raising awareness. This support was crucial. It allowed the West Memphis Three to afford a new, high-powered legal team and to hire forensic experts who could re-examine the case with a level of scrutiny that had been absent in 1994. The defense strategy shifted to focus on two main fronts: exposing the misconduct of the original trial and using modern forensic science to prove their innocence. The legal team, now including top appellate attorneys like Dennis Reardon and Don Horgan, uncovered evidence of significant juror misconduct. They learned that the jury foreman had not only discussed Miskelly's confession during deliberations, but had also consulted with his lawyer's son about the case, bringing outside influence into the jury room. Key witnesses for the prosecution began to recant their testimony. Vicki Hutchison and her son Aaron both admitted that they had fabricated their entire stories under police pressure. But the most powerful new evidence came from a field that had been in its infancy at the time of the murders: DNA testing. In the early 2000s, the defense team fought a long legal battle just to gain access to the physical evidence for testing. The state of Arkansas resisted at every turn. Finally, in 2007, the results of comprehensive DNA analysis of the crime scene evidence were released. They were nothing short of explosive. Out of all the material tested, ligatures, clothing, samples from the victims' bodies, not a single trace of DNA from Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, or Jesse Miskelly, was found. The complete absence of their DNA at a crime scene, described as a bloody, hands-on struggle, was a stunning refutation of the state's entire case. The tests did, however, produce new leads. A single human hair was found caught in one of the knots of the shoelaces used to bind Michael Moore. Mitochondrial DNA testing revealed that this hair was consistent with the DNA of Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of victim Stevie Branch. Another hair, found on a tree stump near where the bodies were discovered, was consistent with the DNA of a friend of Hobbs, David Jacoby. Terry Hobbs had a history of domestic violence and had been inconsistent in his statements to police, yet he had never been treated as a serious suspect. This new forensic evidence pointed directly away from the convicted men and toward individuals the police had overlooked. Armed with this powerful new exculpatory evidence, the defense filed for new trials. The state of Arkansas, incredibly, fought back, arguing that the DNA results were inconclusive and that the original verdicts should stand. But the weight of the evidence, combined with the mounting public pressure and the recantations of key witnesses, was becoming overwhelming. In 2010, in a landmark decision, the Arkansas Supreme Court finally intervened. They vacated the lower court's rulings and ordered new evidentiary hearings for all three men, acknowledging that the new DNA evidence and the proof of juror misconduct were compelling enough to cast serious doubt on the fairness of the original trials. It was the first real judicial acknowledgment that a grave injustice might have occurred. It was the first real glimmer of hope in 17 years. The state of Arkansas was now backed into a corner. They faced the prospect of retrying the case in a completely different climate. The Satanic Panic had long since subsided, and the state's original case, stripped of its hysterical context, looked appallingly weak. They would have to face a world-class defense team, armed with DNA evidence that exonerated their clients and implicated another man. The potential for a high-profile acquittal, followed by massive civil lawsuits that could bankrupt the county, was very real. So, in the summer of 2011, prosecutors approached the defense with an extraordinary and controversial proposal, an Alford plea. This obscure legal maneuver would allow Damien, Jason, and Jesse to be released from prison immediately. In exchange, they would have to plead guilty to the murders they had spent nearly 2 decades fighting, while simultaneously being permitted to publicly maintain their innocence. It was a devil's bargain. For the state, it was a way to avoid the risk and public humiliation of a new trial. It allowed them to save face by keeping the convictions on the books, effectively closing the case forever. For the West Memphis 3, it was an agonizing, almost impossible choice. To accept the deal meant freedom. It meant Damien Echols would walk off death row. But it also meant validating, on paper, the very convictions that had stolen their youth. It meant they would forever carry the legal stain of being convicted child murderers. The decision fractured the three men. Jesse Miskelly, worn down by years in prison, was willing to take the deal. Damien Echols, his health failing after years of brutal conditions on death row, saw it as his only chance to survive. But Jason Baldwin was vehemently opposed. "It's not the truth," he told his lawyers. "I'm not going to sign a piece of paper that says I'm a murderer." He was willing to risk staying in prison for the chance to be fully exonerated in a new trial. The final, heartbreaking decision came down to him. His lawyers and even Echols himself had to persuade him that by refusing the deal, he would be condemning his friend Damien to death. Reluctantly, and in an act of profound sacrifice for his friend, Jason Baldwin agreed. On August 19, 2011, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly, no longer teenagers but men in their mid-30s, stood in a courtroom one last time. They entered their Alford pleas. The judge accepted them, resentenced them to the 18 years and 78 days they had already served, and declared them free. They walked out of the courthouse into the bright Arkansas sunlight, free from their cells but not from their past. They were free, but they had never been exonerated. The case of the West Memphis Three is a chilling portrait of systemic failure. The anatomy we have dissected is one where the immune system of justice, its checks and balances, its presumption of innocence, its reliance on evidence, was completely overwhelmed by the infection of a moral panic. The investigation was not a search for truth, but a desperate hunt for a scapegoat that fit a pre-written satanic narrative. Confirmation bias drove every decision, as investigators ignored evidence, like the bloody man at the restaurant, that pointed away from their chosen suspects, while embracing any rumor or innuendo that supported their theory. Jesse Miskelly's confession, extracted from a vulnerable and intellectually disabled teenager through hours of psychological manipulation, was not a piece of evidence, but a weapon forged to justify a foregone conclusion. The trials were not a forum for justice, but a stage for a grotesque morality play, where heavy metal music and black clothing were presented as irrefutable proof of evil. It was a failure of the police, who let hysteria dictate their investigation, a failure of the prosecutors, who valued a conviction above the truth, and a failure of the courts, which for nearly 2 decades refused to acknowledge the profound and obvious flaws in the case against these 3 men. They were freed not because the system corrected itself, but because of the relentless efforts of filmmakers, journalists, celebrities, and they were saved by the very outsiders the system was designed to crush. The ultimate lingering tragedy of this case extends beyond the 18 years stolen from 3 innocent men. It is the cold, hard fact that the real killer or killers of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers has never been held accountable. The Alford plea allowed the state of Arkansas to wash its hands of the matter, closing the book on the case and leaving the truth buried beneath a cynical legal technicality. Damian Eccles, now an author and artist, continues to fight for full exoneration, pushing for new, more advanced DNA testing on the evidence that could finally identify the person whose DNA was found at the scene. The community of West Memphis received a conviction, but they may never receive the closure that comes with knowing the real monster has been caught. The case remains a stark and enduring monument to how easily fear can be weaponized, how swiftly a seductive narrative can overpower facts, and how, in the frantic pursuit of a monster, it is sometimes possible for the justice system to become a monster itself. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.